has been shocked by the so-called reciprocal tariffs by Donald Trump on all imports to the US, and also this recent development in Trump's tariffs have significant implications to the world and also ASEAN, particularly Malaysia. And Malaysia has been slapped with 24% reciprocal tariffs, while other ASEAN countries such as Vietnam face even higher number. And additionally, countries with large trade deficits with the US face also higher tariffs. True specific rates for Malaysia are not detailed in recent announcement in terms of the fraction of it. And the US has also escalated tariffs on China, reaching the total of 104% on tariffs for China. And this measure risks triggering a global trade war and also have already led to market volatility. And for Malaysia, these tariffs could increase cost and also export and imports, potentially affecting its economy. And also, we might see a hyperinflation in the US itself. What is the reality and why Trump is actually using tariff as his weapon now? And joining us to discuss further is Professor Emeritus Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, economist, visiting senior fellow at Khazanah Research Institute. We also have Harizal Hazri, political economy analyst, senior advisor, Higher Committee of Human Fraternity UAE. Harizal also currently serves as the adjunct professor at the Department of Political Science, Public Administration and Economic Development Studies, Faculty of Business and Economics, University of Malaya, Malaysia. And also we have David Stifford, Country Manager Singapore, Dezan Shira and Associates. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. First of all, do these newly imposed tariffs basically reflect a form of protectionism, or basically are they part of the broader strategy of Donald Trump's administration of economic competition and also dealing with trade imbalances in the point of view of US? Prof. Jomo.
Well, thank you, Najib. My own view is a bit unusual. I basically do not see the announcement last week as final. I think it is part of his larger strategy of shock and awe, of being a disruptor, of reminding the world it is America first, and we need to make America great again. It is highly likely that the U.S. Congress will reject the decision as infringement on their prerogatives. So far it's an executive decision which has been announced, and but traditionally, according to the American Constitution, trade is handled by the Congress. Needs congressional approval. Now, as an executive order, you can invoke the idea of an emergency, which may not stand up to judicial scrutiny. So it is possible that the whole thing will be abandoned. And President Trump can then claim that he tried his best to save America, but it was rejected by Congress. But more importantly, he has achieved his objective of shocking the world, of showing that he means business, of reminding everybody in the world that it is America's number one. And that, I think, has been largely achieved. It will be tied up in procedures for some time to come, and the tariffs will be introduced, and eventually there will be a face-saving compromise between Congress and the presidency and the White House. And my own expectation is that that face-saving compromise will focus on his intended victims, if you want to put it that way. Everybody expects, of course, China and Iran to be on that list. But beyond China and Iran, it is very likely that some of the other countries which are not exactly on the same page as the Trump administration may also be affected. But that remains to be seen. It remains to be seen as to how much the tolerance of the rest of the American business elite will be for some of these measures, because the impact will be pretty significant. In terms of employment, it's very unlikely to create the employment effects, because many of these changes are not going to be achievable in the short term. You can't simply generate the kind of production which is needed. overnight. And that kind of capacity is very difficult. At the level of the more sophisticated types of jobs, for example, we have seen the difficulties of the TSMC relocation to New Mexico, which has really not worked out. So I think one has to recognize Mr. Trump for who's reminding the world that he's the disruptor par excellence, and its likely impact for all of us. Needless to say, the rest of the world is scrambling to try to make sense of this, and we will see a great deal of adjustment. But it's very likely that the only major economies, particularly China and possibly Europe, but Europe doesn't do trade policy together on many issues, only vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So there will be some difficulty getting a European consensus in terms of the appropriate response. Bigger countries may be bolder, but they are also still all part of NATO, and there will be an attempt to try to adjust. There'll be those who will want to preserve the Western alliance, and there will be those who feel that it's time to look at new options. So it remains to be seen what is likely to happen. But there's going to be a great deal of ferment over coming months as this whole thing plays itself out. Thank you.
Yeah. David, could you help us understand? Donald Trump is basically a businessman at the end of the day, but do you see that what he did now and what he has now is doing, basically Donald Trump is trying as a businessman trying to get all countries to the negotiating table as a businessman?
So, excellent question. Also, Professor Doro, thank you for what you just said. I agree with that, but I would like to add a little bit more color to that. So, if this is a negotiation strategy to get people to the table, right? That's quite a strategy. When you look at the value stock markets have lost like over the last week, the damage to the economy, there's a lot of uncertainty as well, which is bad for business, right? So there is damage being done right now in the short term. Okay, now we get companies to the table. What's the goal here, right? Like concessions, like in terms of removing tariffs. I think Vietnam offered that, right? I think the US rejected and said like, oh, zero tariffs is not enough. You also need to buy more from us, right? Some of these economies will not be in a position to buy more from the US, right? Maybe this is just targeted at China, right? Like, and everybody else is just collateral damage potentially. I don't think there's a strategy to this. I think Trump is a big fan of tariffs. I think he had viewpoints and echoed talking points that he's having now, like in the 1980s, when there's a lot of Japanese products flooding the US market. I think he also looks favorably on William McKinley, a US president that was president at the end of the 19th century, who also used tariffs, but the world economy was very different back then, right? Like, so now we are more integrated, and in the end, the people that pay the highest price, they're the American consumers and companies that are actually paying these tariffs. So I'm not sure if this is the right move to show everyone that America is here and great. So with that said, we have to see how it plays out. I think there's room to negotiate, definitely, because there will be pain, and there is pain to the American economy. Also, when you look at the market reactions, but then, of course, also now that these tariffs, and they have only actually been implemented since today, you will see more pain over the next coming days when companies and consumers have to pay these prices, right? If there is a plan to it, I cannot say. From the outside, it doesn't look like it. It looks like the wrong tool was used for the job. I think there were 7 other ways to do this, and Trump chose number 8. And I'm not sure if it was the best way to address the perceived shortcomings here in these trade relationships. I think there would have been better and less damaging ways to deal with this. We will see what the end goal is. We will also see these negotiations. I think everyone is on their way to Washington now to negotiate the removal of these tariffs. So we will see how that plays out if the US administration is amicable to this. But I think America has lost a lot of trust right now because, in the end, trade, like any other relationship, is about trust. And if you cannot trust your trade partner, then you will be more cautious, right? So I think here global trade has been damaged, and we have to see if this trust can be regained.
Harizal, I know you have a lot to say about this, but Harizal, what do you make of the tariffs, and is this the so-called Great Reset for the US to the world economy? What's the end game here?
I don't know, Najib. I mean, that's very difficult to say whether if it's the end game. Is it a reset to the global system? I mean, we know that a lot of work has been put into WTO, and we know that the economy has flourished to a certain extent, and people understand, or economies understand how important free trade is. So is it a shock to that? Yes, I think it is a shock to that. I'm not very concerned about what it is doing to the system, quite frankly. What I'm concerned about is that we now see the failures or the weaknesses of trading blocks or countries, trading blocks, and at times like this, you will see that it's not easy for these countries to pivot, and especially developing countries, right? It is a problem because people say that, oh, countries should just look at new markets. It's not as easy as that. You need conditions to enable countries to allow them to pivot. Jobs are going to be lost, right, in these countries. FDI, the flow of FDI will be disrupted. Business is not as usual. But the biggest loser is essentially the normal people who are who wants to do something, who's working for salaries at the end of the month. I mean, I'm not too concerned about the big businesses. I think some kind of shock to big businesses is good. So that they would be pushed to, for instance, think about technology. I always say I'm consistently shocked, even when I was in Malaysia, and still now that, some of the Malaysia's largest producers of gloves employs, thousands of workers when they could have actually automated a lot of these processes. There's no real push for them to do that because, foreign labor has always been cheap in Malaysia. And there's no real urge to penalize these companies, even if, during COVID, we see how, there was very, very bad sort of like planning and how to deal with, all these workers, right? Foreign workers. Now, when you have things like that, like this, and if, let's say, their market, their exports, and look at our rubber products, for instance, gloves, let's say their exports to the US would be affected. What do you think they're going to do first? They're going to lay off workers, right? So how are you going to deal with that? So this is to me something that worries me. I'm not very interested in Trump's politics. I'm not very interested in his tactics. Of whether if this is his strategy to open negotiation and to get people to come down and bow down and look at America. I mean, I think those are very high level sort of like, conversations. But, what happened to the workers? How are these countries going to ensure that people can continue to have a decent living? And I think this is also an opportunity, despite all those challenges, quite frankly. And I know that I've said this so many times, and I'm very concerned about myself saying it over and over again because I do sound like a damaged loudspeaker. But I mean, countries needs to really ensure that they have enough avenues to deal with situations like this. They cannot take things easy and feel that the world will continue to operate like how it is. we need to, for instance, Malaysia, if we look at Malaysia, we need to strengthen legislation. We need to protect workers better. We need to ensure that, there's some level of automation so that businesses can pivot better and easier. We need to ensure that people get more education, the workforce, so that they themselves can move from one sector to another, and to make the economies more resilient. I think the immediate shock right now is that countries wants to discuss with America. We are sending delegation to Washington. ASEAN is meeting. Very little conversation right now is like, when are we going to learn, right? From all these shocks that is happening to the world. It could be the pandemic. It could be some environmental issue next year. It could be, now it's the tariff. I think economies are not building themselves to be more resilient. I think the fundamental question of protection of labor, the fundamental question of strengthening sectors, we have forgotten about that. So in times like this, we need the countries to be resilient. My point is, I'm not entirely sure whether if they are resilient, and I'm not entirely sure whether if we are putting enough conversation to again become this damaged loudspeaker to say this thing over and over and over again. These are the things that we have to put as the key important things that we need in our economy.
Interesting points, Harizal. I want to ask the three panelists, starting with Harizal, because Harizal mentioned about the failures and weaknesses of trading blocs. Now that we have, trading bloc like ASEAN unified in to certain extent in facing challenges, and we have also President Prabowo meeting Prime Minister Dr. Anwar Ibrahim. We also have the Finance Minister meeting this week in Malaysia to discuss about this as well. But do you see that ASEAN have the concerted effort in that sense, and also, can ASEAN, basically change the way we face unprecedented challenges? And have we learned anything from the previous and past the shocks or challenges before? Starting with Harizal.
No, we have not. And it's all a lot of meetings, and let's have a concerted voice, to deal with this tariff. And then, for all you know, a day later, Vietnam went on and discussed themselves, right? And then Cambodia went. The fact of the matter is, this is painful and very difficult because I am a staunch supporter of ASEAN, right? I think it is one of the great ideas that we have. I think it has done good in many fronts. But at the same point, look at the diverse, different backgrounds of countries that we have in ASEAN. We have failed to address that as a bloc. How can we go and negotiate in one voice when you have economies like Laos and Myanmar, and you have Malaysia, and you have Singapore, you have Indonesia? These are all very diverse economies. Even systems are different. This can be a strength to ASEAN. It can also be a weakness. The problem is that there is no concerted policy that is binding for all ASEAN to go on to discuss, on issues like this, with a very sort of like, concerted agenda. I mean, like all the countries come together to agree first. Some people will say this is a good thing. The EU is like that to a certain extent as well. But I don't know, if you ask me whether if ASEAN has changed, I don't think they have. I don't think there is enough conversations. I mean, my personal experience when dealing with ASEAN today, I remember a lot of our past leadership. They would tell me that ASEAN leaders used to be friends. They know each other very well. Now they only meet during meetings. I don't really know if there is a more deeper relationship at the ASEAN level. So anyways, I don't want to move this conversation, and I don't want to make it about ASEAN and stuff like that. But to respond to your question, I think there are multiple levels of challenges that we have failed to address as a nation, as a group of countries in Southeast Asia. And we have been reactive in many ways rather than proactive. Yes, we have the ASEAN trade agreement and stuff like that within ASEAN. But, do we go and have a concerted voice? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So yeah, anyways, that's my opinion on that.
Prof. Jomo, help us to understand better.
Yes, thank you. I think there are many challenges, as both our other panelists have emphasized. But let me suggest to you that the way forward might be, on the one hand, provided by ASEAN in the sense that we have a standing commitment to something called ZOCFAN, creating a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. And today, in the world in which we live, there's almost nobody promoting the idea of non-alignment, of not taking sides in the increasingly multipolar world in which we live. Neither are we thinking very seriously about promoting cooperation and development. I think the challenges which Harizal, for example, reminded us of are still very, very pressing. And the fact that we have had a lot of foreign labor, for example, in Malaysia, which have basically had the effect of keeping real wages down, has been a huge challenge, and we need to begin to address these issues. But more importantly, I think we have a huge opportunity here with the chair of ASEAN in Malaysia's hands, that the response does not necessarily mean going ASEAN. The response could well be something called ASEAN Plus 3, which now has many manifestations, including the so-called RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, which is a huge and most importantly includes what the other three countries, China, Japan, and Korea, are all significant economies. ASEAN is almost not a significant player, frankly, at the global level. But ASEAN plus 3 would be. And this is precisely why we need to be able to coordinate. But it is very difficult for reasons which my colleagues have already emphasized. It is very difficult to have a coordinated, because the tariffs impact different countries differently. And as Tolstoy reminded us, different countries suffer differently, they mourn separately, but together we can do certain things which are not being discussed right now. And this precisely through ASEAN Plus 3. We need to begin to think of cooperation well beyond creating free trade areas and so on. There are so many possible areas of economic cooperation which are hardly ever discussed. And we need to begin to think about this and discuss this not only at this ASEAN Plus 3 or RCEP level, but even beyond, talking to the rest of the non-aligned, the developing countries and the non-aligned movement and so on, because we need to basically reopen the options which are available to us in this region. And we need to have, for example, have much more financial cooperation to introduce a greater degree of financial stability. Trade instability doesn't necessarily mean financial instability. There's no direct proportional relationship, and we can try to ensure that. At the same time, we should not be going after some of these ideas which are being put around, but which really do not have much to offer. For example, the idea of an ASEAN currency, or the idea of East Asian currency. I think the fact that there is the US dollar has been dominant, and we should not be engaged in pursuing that. We have seen, for example, how South Africa and Brazil have been pushing for the idea of a BRICS currency, and causing a lot of distraction. And we have seen how President Trump has come down very, very hard on BRICS, primarily because of that issue. Let's take it off the table. If you look, for example, at the recent writing of the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors of Trump, he is talking about a systemic change. I think he exaggerates his argument, but he is talking about systemic change. The tariffs are a means to a larger agenda which he envisages. Now, whether one agrees with it or not, that is the agenda which is envisaged, and we cannot talk about this question of tariffs without recognizing that. So we should not be thinking about a confrontational approach. let us think of a more cooperative approach, cooperation within the region, but also well beyond the region, in order that we can have a significant outcome. Let's face it, the world economy was already slowing down before the tariffs proposal, and it was largely slowing down because of what has been happening in NATO, what has been happening in Europe. And the economic slowdown in Europe is very palpable. It is not something which has just started because of Mr. Trump. It started even before that. And so now the idea is that, some kind of military Keynesianism of, Germany, instead of producing luxury cars, will start producing tanks instead, and so on and so forth. That is not the way to go. That is not the way of uplifting the world. We should be moving towards producing far more to improve the conditions of life for the vast majority of people. And right now we have a situation which is not conducive to that. And we need to begin to think in those terms. But Europe, to some extent, will need to begin to rethink its options as well, and other parts of the world. I mean, let's face it, Trump won. You had the USMCA, and the USMCA, which was replaced NAFTA, is something which Trump himself has dumped. The World Trade Organization it doesn't mean very much anymore right now. But at the same time, let's face it, who are the billionaires in the world who populate the Trump cabinet and so on? The billionaires in the world have almost all made their money from tech monopolies, which are strengthened by TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights. So we will see that there will be a retention of the form, of the semblance of law, of international law, but there will continue to be disorder when international law no longer is conducive to the interests of the powerful interests of the world. So we really need to rethink our options, and this is the kind of conversation we should be trying to promote within the region and well beyond.
Yeah. David, you mentioned earlier on that basically the understanding that Trump wants to target China and the rest could be just the collateral damage. But how do you link up to the ASEAN Plus 3? Because it also includes China in the discussion. But do you see that the ASEAN Plus 3, like what Prof. Jomo has mentioned, should be propelled further in facing difficulties and challenges posed by the US?
So there's a few things to unpack here. Let me perhaps start with ASEAN, and there were some very good points raised by Professor Jomo. As a trade bloc, ASEAN is expected to be the fourth largest economy in the world by 2030, right, with a GDP of 4.5 trillion US dollars. And there's a lot of potential here, right? Like for countries to work together, to uplift each other, and of course to trade with each other, right? Like I think we see a successful example of that in the European Union, right? That started as an economic union. Then there was also a united currency, right? And now I think there's a lot of talk about political and military integration as well. In general, we are stronger together. That goes for ASEAN, as well as for any other trade bloc in the world. So in a world that is more fragmented, where the international rules-based order may be largely in place, I also believe that, just like Professor Jomo said, in the future, but where there's, I think, more space for more powerful countries to carve out their positions, countries need to work together, right? Like no country, especially the smaller ones, can be successful here on their own. So for ASEAN, it is really important to work together. There is markets that can be discovered. And then, of course, it makes sense to also have free trade agreements with other countries, especially the regional powerhouses like Japan, like South Korea, like China. Looking at China, of course, and trade, and this is what Trump is saying, and he does have a point. So trade can make things difficult. The benefits may not immediately be obvious, right? Like, so US consumers have been benefiting from low-cost consumer goods for a very long time. They're produced in Asia, right? Like, and now they are, of course, complaining that they have lost the manufacturing capabilities, right? This wasn't stolen. There were conscious decisions, and people said, okay, we don't want to have factories here, and somebody else does it somewhere for cheaper, right? And even now, American workers, if you ask them, do you want to work in a factory for 12 hours every day, or do you want a desk job? I think most will prefer the desk job, right? So manufacturing has gone to other jurisdictions. And when we look at China right now, China is flooding ASEAN with low-cost products, right? Like, so ASEAN consumers can benefit, but of course, it also puts pressure on domestic industries, right? Like, so for example, you saw countries in the region have banned TikTok Shop, for example, like Indonesia did, right? Vietnam has banned Temu. So there's definitely a pushback on trade, right? And when we talk about this, so I'm a believer in trade is win-win for everyone, right? Like it makes countries better off. Consumers benefit through lower prices, and countries need to make sure that they offer support to affected industries, that they build resilience into the system, and that's the government's job, right? Like, so they need to make sure that certain things are addressed. And I'm not saying trade is all perfect, and just because you trade, everybody will be better off. There will be friction, right? Because markets may be flooded with a product that puts domestic industries out of work. And this needs to be addressed, whether that's through upskilling and reskilling, whether that's through government grants. Sometimes countries also want to build up strategic industries. So they will have tariffs on certain imports to just make sure they can retain that capability. But you will never be able to do everything, right? Like, so trade will always exist. And I think here huge opportunities for ASEAN and also Asia to work together, but also trade with other blocs, like, for example, the European Union. World trade will continue. The US amounts for only roughly 14-15% of global trade. They make it more difficult, sure, if they want to be autark by producing everything themselves. They can look at North Korea, how that will be going. So if they are not part of the trade system and they don't want to trade, then that's up to them, right? Like, so I believe this will just be a blip, and either Trump will go back, or even if he doesn't, I think subsequent US administrations will adjust this again, just because it will not benefit the US consumers or US industry. So we have to see how it plays out. But I think global trade is here to stay, and we will just see it flowing around the US, like other countries will trade with each other, right? And then, of course, there will be problems. They need to be addressed within the European Union. There's issues within ASEAN. There's trade issues. They need to be addressed. But here, it makes sense to have a good policy and stewardship on these issues. Because otherwise we may see a backlash like you see right now in the US that really doesn't benefit anyone. So I think rightly managed, this will benefit everyone. And then of course trade like has made us well off, right? Like if we are doing well, you are doing well, everybody's doing well, then there's less reasons for wars or conflict, right? Like, so I think trade is the way to go here. And especially in ASEAN, I think there's huge potential for more economic integration that will benefit everyone here in the region.
Yeah, David, you mentioned about huge opportunities because Malaysia has listed down that we're going to focus on Africa, Middle East and South America markets after this. And I want to ask David as well, because like what Harizal mentioned just now, we never learned from the previous shocks and also challenges that we faced being COVID or before COVID itself until right now, the tariffs war. How can we take this as the great time for us to change structurally in terms of we lay out our policies and objectives? You know, Harizal mentioned also about we are more reactive rather than proactive. What does it take for country to be proactive? Political willingness or smart leaders, who know how to do stuff and strategy proactively?
Both, but I would also say just because Malaysia and like honestly every country in the world is affected by these tariffs right now doesn't necessarily point to some kind of shortfall, right? Like, because in the end you deal with countries that buy your products, right? Like, so it may become an issue when you are overly reliant on a single market to buy your products, right? Like, so if they buy a lot of your products and you are like an export-led economy, And then suddenly that breaks away via a seismic shift that we see now with tariffs, right? Like, so you have to adjust. We could argue, okay, we need to be diversifying, so we need to have several markets instead of being super reliant on a single market. But in the end, companies try to maximize shareholder value, right? Like, so they will go where their clients are, whoever's buying, right? And they will try to maximize profits, right? So saying that, then, like, when you say, oh, we need to diversify and we can't be over reliant on market, that may also come with a certain cost. There may be less growth of that because there's teething issues. Maybe these other markets are not necessarily buying from you. Free trade agreements need to be negotiated. When you look at Africa, sure, like, I think there are a few economies there that may like take some products, but in general, it's tiny compared to other economies in the world, right? Like, so there is drawbacks, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say things could have done better by diversifying, because there's a cost to that as well, right? Like, so and things like we see right now with the US, that's very unusual, right? Like, so just like COVID, can these things be predicted? Giant shocks that affect everyone? If so, then great. But like, I believe nobody could have really predicted the size and magnitude of this. And sure, it makes sense to react now, of course, right? Like, because it seems like that is a risk that is now obvious, right? Because we've seen it. We've seen the willingness to impose tariffs like this on everyone, on kickstarting a global trade war. Good. I think now it makes sense to look at setting up things more resilient, diversifying. Absolutely, right? Would it have made sense before? I'm not sure about that. So that's something I think also when we talk about politics and business leaders, that should have probably come from politics. But to give you an example from my home country in Germany, the German government put out like a manual on how to deal with China, and it was basically because they want German companies to diversify from China, not just be overly reliant on it. There's a lot of German car manufacturers that make a lot of money from China, and they said, oh, what if relationships sour? So don't be too over reliant on that single market, but it was non-binding. And actually, after that was published, you saw German FDI in China still going up. It's like nobody read it, nobody cared, right? Like, so then the question is, what can governments do to successfully diversify, right? And like to educate about the risks and have companies adopt to it. So I think that's difficult to answer. So in general, I think nothing. This is just how it works, right? We sell to whoever wants to buy, right? Like, and there may then like dependencies might materialize, but if you reduce them, it will come at a cost. And the question is, are you willing to bear that cost? Most of the time, if everything goes well, nobody wants to do that, right? And then only now that we have massive shocks, we are talking about it.
Yeah, Harizal, there's a lot of reality checks during COVID and pandemic. Why haven't we learned anything in terms of the facing shocks? Because this is not the first time we've seen tariffs being the weapon. During Trump's administration 1.0 is just not to all countries, but this time around it's to all imports to the US. Why haven't we learned from all this?
First of all, let's not be, let's not say that we have not learned anything, right? So I think that's an overstatement. But before I get to that, I would like to, reflect a little bit on your previous question on looking at other economies, diversifying, and looking at other regions for trade and stuff like that. Quite frankly, this is a consistent recycling of ideas that has happened, and I'm just referring to my country because I can't talk about other countries, but every time we have a shock, oh, let's go and open shop somewhere else and stuff like that. Fact of the matter is, if you want to diversifying your economy or opportunities should be a consequence of a strong policy and strong system that you have. You cannot say that you want to diversify without addressing some fundamental issues of the economies, because that's not going to happen, right? So I think what has been happening is that every time things happen, we keep on saying the same things, but we never actually address big issues or fundamental issues that we have that would strengthen Malaysia as a trading partner. Okay, so that's my point. I'll give an example so that it's a bit easier to consume. If we go back and look at the pandemic, we realize that Malaysia produces a lot of edible materials, right? From vegetables, from meat and stuff like that. And we even have all these goods that went to waste because there was a disruption in terms of the supply chain, transportation, and so on and so forth. But what's very, very stark was that a lot of this could have actually been addressed if we had modernized our agricultural sector and if we had put more effort in strengthening or bringing up the level of our supply chain systems in Malaysia. We didn't do that before COVID, right? So we realized it when COVID happened. We could have actually played a bigger role in terms of supplying not just in our country, but certain parts of the world, with food during that time. What would that mean? It means that some of the businesses can operate almost as usual. It also means that we can expand to new markets. It also means that we develop new relationships and friendships because, we become the friend who is a friend in need, right? So all of this is positive, but we can't do that because, as I said, we did not develop all these issues that we have in the country. Okay, now, did we learn from that? We wrote a paper at ISIS of creating a global alliance for food security, for instance. And it was basically presented and agreed, in the UAE at that time for the UAE and Malaysia to start this initiative. And it was taken very seriously by the UAE. But coming back, we had fundamental sort of policy issues that although we had this idea, we couldn't push this agenda forward. I'm just giving one example of how a reaction to a crisis, even if you have an idea, you can't move it forward if you don't address, fundamental policy issues and systemic issues in the country. Okay, so that's number one on why I think it's not very easy to just diversify and look at new markets. It's a nice and easy thing to say. It's not very easy to do. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, the other thing is that why haven't we learned, right? Now, I think that is a very difficult and complex question to answer. It's not that it's no willingness. I think one of the key, maybe one of the most simplistic way to answer that question is because these are very difficult things to do. And sometimes we know that it needs to be done, but we just don't know how to do it, to be fair, right? We need to bring more people together to try and find solution of how even to strengthen our supply chain system in Malaysia. That's not as easy as it sounds, right? Because it is so difficult and complicated, I think some policymakers somewhat abandon the idea because they want to move on to low-hanging fruits, things that can show or that can give you fast returns, and stuff like that. So in the long run, the fundamental issues are not being addressed properly. What have changed since? I was in Malaysia then, and now I'm not in Malaysia. I don't think much have actually changed at in trying to address this, this very technical and fundamental issues, which makes it very difficult for us to just pivot. So at the end of the day, my point is that we can say all of this. It makes it keeps the general public calm. Okay, let's go to Africa. Okay, let's go to the Middle East. But I think fundamentally that's not as easy as it might seem because we have not addressed key issues in the country.
Prof. Jomo, a few years ago, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken, 3 years ago, there was a significant global discourse surrounding the idea of Great Reset. And in your view, have we actually moved towards the reset in any meaningful way that we are ready to face future shocks such as, tariffs and other things in the future?
Well, I'm not sure which of the many conversations about resetting you're referring to. There was one, of course, triggered by the pandemic, and then there were earlier ones. Every time people think that there's a great technical breakthrough, that everything is going to change, and so on and so forth. Well, the fact of the matter is that whatever you might think about them, Mr. Trump has basically forced everybody to rethink. Okay, and this is, I think, the if you're looking for the silver lining to this huge dark cloud, that is the. Now, I think we have not learned our lessons from the past, including from our mistakes, and that is a sad thing. If we keep on patting our backs on the things we have succeeded in doing, but we don't learn the lessons from mistakes, then we get into trouble, and we are likely to repeat those or similar mistakes. Take, for example, the policy on chicken production in Malaysia. Before going into the pandemic, we were the largest exporter of source of the largest imports of chicken into Singapore. We lost that position, unnecessarily because of ill-conceived knee-jerk responses. And we also have other examples as well, but we also have successes which we can learn from. For example, when Malaysia almost half a century ago made a huge breakthrough in terms of refining palm oil, we became the most efficient palm oil refiner in the world. But Europe at that time, the common market, closed its doors to us and escalated the tariffs. But instead of learning from how we overcame them, which was basically through finding new markets, and they were very significant. The first market we found was India. The second market we found was the former Soviet Union. The third one was Pakistan, and the fourth one was China. It was huge, especially at a time after the end of the Bretton Woods system, when nobody knew what was the future of the international monetary system. So we have been able to innovate in the past, but we don't even acknowledge them when you talk about the successful examples of industrial policy in Malaysia. Almost nobody talks about the successful refining of palm oil, which was no mean achievement. Instead, we talk about electronics. But when in fact, almost all the electronics production in Malaysia is on behalf of foreign companies who happen to locate in Malaysia because of cheap labor. Now, we don't even understand our own successes. We don't even acknowledge our own mistakes and learn from them. So I think it's very important for us to think very carefully. We are not in a position of having great resets to determine great resets. We are responsive. As a small open economy, we are still largely reacting, but we need to be able to be more proactive even in our reacting, as in the case, for example, about refined palm oil. And these are the kinds of lessons which we need to learn going forward. Take, for example, we have been talking for decades about promoting medium-sized industries in Malaysia. What have we actually done for them? We throw a little bit of money once in a while and hope that somehow or other it's going to work. Now, when Japan industrialized, they had a big problem. So a lot of medium-sized firms emerged, and but they couldn't organize their own marketing internationally. So there was this phenomenon there were these firms called Sogo Soshas which emerged, and the Sogo Soshas emerged and were quite successful and overcame what in the language in the technical language, or rather the academic language, is called collective action problems. We overcame the collective action problems by the Sogo Soshas doing this, which was precisely what the Malaysian government did when we started refining palm oil. If we left it to the companies to start negotiating, none of them would negotiate because there was always a first mover cost, first mover disadvantage for doing so. But it was the Malaysian government we started making these arrangements with India, the Soviet Union, Pakistan, and China, and that overcame the collective action problem. So we need to learn from when the government has been successful. We need to learn how to move forward and so on and so forth. And this, I think, is very crucial. So if we are thinking today about Malaysian firms, the vast majority of Malaysian firms are actually medium-sized and small. And we need to begin to think of ways in which we can effectively support them through for example, enabling them to go forward effectively. But instead, our trade promotion efforts are largely on behalf of very large companies, including large Malaysian companies, I have to agree. But the fact of the matter is that the people who need the most help to be able to make that kind of breakthrough. So we need to talk about, we need to talk about resetting. If we are serious about resetting, we need to move forward. Now, the Malaysian government came out with a so-called new industrial master plan. But there are so many industries on that industrial master plan list, it doesn't make any sense. You have to prioritize. You have to see where you can make your breakthroughs, where you are most likely to succeed with your breakthroughs, rather than have a long checklist of everything possible. And what have we chosen from that? We have chosen semiconductors. Semiconductors now, what President Trump has done gives us the opportunity to back out of that, because we have tried semiconductors for almost half a century. The first semiconductors were being assembled in places like Penang about half a century ago, and we've done that. You can't do that when you don't have the firms. We are not Taiwan. We just do not have the Malaysian firms to do that. So let's be real. Let's get real and look at our strengths. And if you go, say, somewhere around Port Klang, for example, there are over 1,000 small engineering firms which are not internationally competitive because they can't make the breakthrough, but they can. Many of them are very, very competent, very, very innovative, occasionally a few breakthrough, but it's almost by accident rather than because of government support or effective collective action on the part of Malaysian firms. So I think this is a chance, Najib, to answer your question more directly. This is a chance for government reset. We had a very nice slogan during the pandemic of talking about an all of government approach and a whole of society approach. These are good slogans, but what does it actually mean? And this is what we need to translate now as we try to go forward to become a much more resilient economy in an increasingly uncertain world.
Yeah. David, I have 1 minute left. I have to ask this because a lot of people have been discussing about this because due to tariffs impacting many countries in the world. Are we heading towards recession in this region?
So I think JP Morgan put the chance of a US recession at 60%, right? ASEAN was very hard hit because all of this manufacturing shifted during Trump's first presidency in the China-US trade war. ASEAN was a net beneficiary. Like a lot of manufacturing was relocated to the region, and many economies here are export-led, right? Like with the US, a large market for them. So there is a risk of this. I would say it depends on how long these tariffs will be in place. It depends on, of course, if exemptions can be negotiated. It depends on many things. So it's difficult to say, but there is definitely a risk of a regional recession, but also, of course, of a global recession.
All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us at this time. Professor Emeritus Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, economist, visiting senior fellow at Khazanah Research Institute. We have Haris Al-Hazri, political economy analyst, senior advisor, Higher Committee of Human Fraternity UAE, and also David Stippert, country director, Singapore, Dizan Shira and Associates. Thank you so much for joining us.